Hello, Brobs. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me. Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide by Dorothy Bloch. I'm not sure which chapter we're on. It's 12, 11, 12, something like that. It's chapter 11. And we're heading into the home stretch. Only about 40 more pages to go. Suicidal thoughts and wishes were also a frequent preoccupation, she wrote. She wrote, "Do you realize what it means to be alive and yet be dead for someone else? What a curse that is. My life feels like it's been one long series of smashes on the head. No wonder I want to be dead or neuter. I'm afraid to think it, but I really do exist, in spite of my father. And because of him, I'm here and nothing he can do can deny it. He sure tried, or so it seemed. He's not fit to have children. I'm glad I was had, because I don't have to accept this shit. But it's so easy to be dead. Everyone thinks it takes such guts to commit suicide, which is crap, because all you need is insistent desperation, which I don't have." At another time, she wrote, "Tonight I was just thinking that I could never commit suicide, ever, because I love life, trite as the phrase may be." At a very low point, some months later, she added, "No, there must be a better way, like leaving forever. The worst thing is I can't stand anybody, because nothing likes me. And if they do, I don't believe it anyway." Later, when her suicidal impulses again came to the fore, she said, "The whole problem is that I don't want to admit I have any emotions or that I care about anybody because no one cares about me. Parents don't. It's so easy and horrible to sag down and down into a murky mud pile and die and rot and stink. Loneliness. The anguish of separation from people, the feeling of being deserted or rejected, invariably brought this theme to the fore. I really want to die," she reiterated, "but I won't do it." Janet's search for identity appeared to start from scratch, beginning with the very fact of existence, of visibility and reality, of being human and a person. In this connection, her ability to perceive me as a person was a very important factor. At one point, when I revealed my summer plans to her, she responded, "Really, you have graduated in my mind to the full status of a person. This is a hard thing to allow because it means that, one, I am also a person. Two, someone knows me. Before, if I thought anybody knew me well, it would be terrible. But the great thing is finding out that it's not so terrible." A few weeks later, she added, "I really like you quite a lot as a person now, not just my sounding board. Oh boy, I feel like a person too. An important aspect of my being is clearly presented about a half year later when she wrote, What I would like to do now is go over to a certain attractive boy. He's leaving. Crap. Now I feel deserted. Can you believe that? I feel deserted when anyone, whether I know them or not, leaves me alone. Are you still there in that eternal chair? I guess you are. At least I believe you're listening, that you exist from one appointment to the next, as opposed to everyone else in this horrible world who, even when they are talking to me, have their goddamn broad, inscrutable father back turned to me." What does that mean? A month later, my status and hers were further defined. "Sometimes it helps to think of you as a mother, a real person, and that maybe a real person. I used to think you were a machine or a pillow who didn't even know I was there. Could like you. You are really nice, and you must like me, judging by things." At another point, she can admit, "You are an unbelievably tremendous help to me, and I'm gradually beginning to trust you," which, believe me, is miraculous because I trust no one. And then tentatively, "I don't really think you'd like it if I wanted you as my mother, because that's a hell of a burden." This was not yet a sustained feeling, however, and in another mood, a month later, she charged me with, "The whole trouble is you, who I don't trust. But then, who have I ever trusted?" She revealed, however, "I'm not really so screwed up underneath. All this resistance to you is to make you care enough to turn into my mother, and then everything will be all right. You should schedule appointments to read my letters. Hope you like them. How could you actually? All these sickening outpourings. I get sick of hearing other people's, but maybe you don't mind because you're doing something for me. And further, if I ever recognize that you're human, that'll be a big step, but it's a hell of a lot easier not to. Her growing awareness of me expressed itself in a concern about the burden of these letters. I wonder if you mind reading all these letters. I'm afraid of what I want, i.e., I want you to want to read them, and that's sticking my neck out pretty far. Where the guillotine usually falls, fell. A half year later, such compunctions are gone. At the bottom of one brief note, she added, "This is a rude note. I wonder if it's all right to be rude to you." Another letter was addressed to Miss Dorothy Blah. She also dared to become insistent. "What I wrote about my father and mother is extremely important. Don't forget it. Just this last sentence, a demand on you, makes me feel like myself because I am asking you to recognize me as a person and remember something I think is important." At another time, when she was overburdened by unfulfilled assignments and having to make important decisions regarding being a writer, she projected all her fears onto me. "Either you're a fake or I'm a fool to think you care." Pardon, I just had a sneezing fit. "You are unchangeably another person, which means complete alienation and oppression. So stop fooling around and come out for for what you are. Parent type, fake. I hate you for being a shitty fake." Some months later, when for the first time she had allowed herself to express fully her ideas and feelings about writing, she again turned on me, but with a difference, and said, "I have too many of my own ideas." Oh God. Am I presuming not to get them out in some form? My own vision and feelings about things. What do you think of this? What the hell do you think? You are a mound of silence. God, what do you think of me? Do you like me? Do you think I'm worth existing? Answer, for Christ's sake. Wow, who the hell am I? The ignored is asking for something. A very impressive aspect of Janet's struggle for identity and for love was the extraordinary energy she brought to it. It is possible that Janet's early memory of her father's love became the igniting force that drove her to find again what she lost when Anne replaced her in his affection. In addition to this early experience, and despite her parents' limited capacity for love, her mother's preference for her brother and her father's for her sister also clearly informed Janet of the nature of her loss. As one of Janet's letters tells us, however, being away from my parents does wonders for my self-image. There is evidence that she made that discovery at a very early age. Although her father was probably correct in ascribing some of her problems to the early absence of her mother and the presence of babysitters, it was Janet's good fortune that one of them was a very warm, creative woman who loved her and communicated the feeling that Janet later sought to duplicate. Her most dramatic experience of a different self-image occurred, however, as a result of her summers at camp. They were her most joyous memories and provided her with another standard by which she could judge people's response to her. As her analysis progressed, she repeatedly placed herself in situations where she might discover what relationships really were and where she fitted in. She wanted to find out about families, how they worked, or how they would respond to her. And so for 2 summers she went to live on a farm. Her fixation on her father was of such staggering dimensions that it was very fortunate that she brought to its resolution such determination. It affected all her relationships. In order to understand the maze through which she tried to find her way, it is important to grasp fully, first of all, that she couldn't get it through her head, as she said, that men love women. In addition, she continued under the influence of the early perception that there was no love between her father and mother, and the conviction that if only Anne could be gotten out of the way, her father would be hers. Her problem with Anne was the first to yield. During the first years of treatment, she didn't dare seek out girls who reminded her of her sister in any way. Invariably, her friendships were repetitions of the cold rejection that she felt she had experienced at her mother's hands. Her reports of the social situations in which Anne was present inevitably alluded to the established fact that nobody noticed Janet at such times, to Janet's consequent withdrawal in advance, and to the predicted response from the others present. She was ignored. By the time she entered college, however, she had thrashed about with her feelings about Anne and had come to understand her selection of friends sufficiently to shift to choices whom she referred to as soft heads, who were no threat to her. They were clearly modeled after Anne, who, aside from her being experienced as more attractive by Janet, was considered by her to be generally passive and intellectually her inferior. Boys, however, were her major preoccupation. Her early relationships with them followed a familiar pattern. She selected boys who were hostile and rejecting, felt paralyzed in their presence, and routinely blamed herself for whatever went wrong. There was one exception, a boy who was committed to another girl at that time. She found herself extraordinarily free with him. When he broke off with the other girl, however, Janet's paralysis returned. These relationships inevitably reflected her feelings about her father. During the early years of her analysis, her sexual fantasies about him, when broken down, invariably sought to establish her power over him. Her concept that her father was also absorbed by the problem of making a choice between her and Anne was revealed by her response to her parents' temporary separation at a later time. Anne was already engaged by then, and it appeared the prize was finally Janet's. At that point, it became apparent that she was terrified her fantasy might be realized. During that entire period, she refused to see her father and only gradually worked through her obsession. At one point, she had a dream in which her father called for her in school in his car. She entered the car and began to disrobe, then realized that her behavior was inappropriate and put her dress on again. Her statement, "I am afraid of being swallowed up and killed and hated and destroyed by men," is basic to an understanding of her relationships with boys. She became aware of her concept of love in a daydream that she described as follows: "If I scream the truth of how I feel, he'll hurt me physically, as thinking of Dad's pent-up violence every minute. Every time Don hits me in one of these dreams, I try to change the ending to me hitting or walking out on him, but it's never believable that way. If I have the last word, I get very frightened that the other, Don, Dad, will hate me, and that if I let them slug me next time, they'll like me again. I think of love in terms of hitting. I can't recognize that this isn't love." The boy in the daydream was homosexual, took drugs, and was given to violent forms of behavior. Her relationships into her last semester at college are best summed up in her own words: "The boys I know are absolute fags. I guess I like them because I don't want to be a woman, and they aren't very good at making me feel like one. But I don't even want to be a person, to exist, so how can I admit I have a body, especially a female one? If I want to be a boy, I can escape myself even more, so I don't have to exist. So I pick boys that are like girls, even though I would never get involved with Marge, but every so often the great desire to have an affair with a girl recurs, and I get scared. If I ever did, I'd hate myself no end. Now suppose you were just the kind of person who thought homo, or at least bisexuality, was okay to try, and you said I should go ahead if I felt like it, and I went ahead and got all screwed up. I mean, in other words, I don't know what to do myself, and I listened to you, but who says you're good to listen to?" Such summations already represented the beginnings of her acceptance of femininity, as do speculations like the following: "I also wonder sometimes how you don't feel terribly burdened with listening to people who want like hell to lean on you and get answers like me. And have you run their lives? I'm feeling sort of castrated when I don't feel I'm running my own, like on and off now. That's probably a very revealing and dangerously unrestrained thing to say, but it just got said. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have a penis, and I think it would be great. I think I would like being a boy as much as a girl. I admire boys too much, and I'm afraid I want to be one. I hardly ever admire girls the way I do boys. because I don't want to be one and don't see good things in being one. Boys have a lot more freedom, sex wise, mainly. They can also grow beards, which is a nice choice to have. Girls have advantages too, though, like wearing colored clothes, having long hair, wearing perfume, and letting boys take risks. I don't know if Artie is exactly risking the way he should in this thing with me. From there, it was just a step to I've sort of realized that boys are people. I used to think that only girls were. And then I found that the minute I admitted to myself I was a woman, I was afraid of people. It's a lot of fun. There are all kinds of possibilities, like having children, and I like men then too. People look at me, maybe they look at everyone, but I notice people seeing me, and some of them always look. And finally, Johnny said I was a good woman and that I seemed to enjoy being one. You can't imagine how happy I was to hear that. It is important to note that Janet's struggle for her identity as a woman was accompanied by a struggle for identity on all levels, and that at its core was the battle to overcome the self-image that she had absorbed from her parents and that helped justify their hatred. A change in the family's fortunes brought them back to the city after their 5 year absence and put an end to Janet's correspondence at the same time that it enabled her to resume regular sessions. As I had already learned from her bi-weekly visits, she was not yet capable of the same freedom of expression in her verbal communication. That took some time. In my presence, her projection of the feelings she experienced in relation to her mother resulted for a time in a negative transference. She came in raging session after session and imputed to me all her mother's negative responses to her. Gradually, however, as her creative forces were simultaneously liberated and a sense of her real identity began to emerge, other feelings came to the fore. For the first time since I knew her, she was able to release her tears as well as her rage. She became bolder in defining the area of her interest, and her persistent search for a viable relationship with a man finally resulted in success. She found the man she wanted and married him. It would be tempting to report that they lived happily ever after. We might expect, however, that marriage might revive and crystallize all of Janet's early fears of her father. Although she married a man who had a capacity for meeting her needs on all levels, he resembled her father sufficiently for her to project onto him all her early feelings. It is also not surprising that her distorted responses to her husband were as tenacious as her earlier conviction that she could actually marry her father, and for the same reason. The paranoia resulting from her terror of her father's actual violence frequently led her during the early years of her marriage to ascribe hostile intentions to her husband's behavior toward her. Similarly, her sexual experience with him initially was constricted by her anticipation of violence. The comment about her daydream contained in one of her letters continued in force. I think of love in terms of hitting. So she brought the same determination and courage, however, to the resolution of her marital problems as she had to her earlier struggle against psychosis and forced herself to separate her husband from her father. Following her marriage, however, I became aware of a new and unexpected and mystifying development. Janet became a little girl. Not only did she experience herself as diminutive in a world of grown-ups, but as the bad girl who had mysteriously provoked her parents' hatred. She searched for disapproval and found it in the nuance of every word or expression. I'm bad, she reiterated session after session. I was frankly puzzled by this turn of events, but suspected that this new obsessive fantasy was related in some way to her earlier one, and that her father, if not both her parents, was involved. The unyielding insistence that characterized this new image had all the earmarks of the defense against terror, but I realized it would be a mistake to ignore the wish that might underlie the fear. I wondered if it could be a proclaimer of innocence and a denial of sexual maturity, and therefore a protection against her father's or her husband's violence and her mother's retaliation. Just prior to and following her marriage, Janet had also begun to write seriously, and I had to allow that this new preoccupation might also be intended to protect her from her mother's jealousy and retaliation. My analytic experience had already informed me that frequently the investment in trying to turn back the clock is linked with a wish to change the past. Although in the course of Janet's analysis, her increasing ego strength had allowed her to abandon the constriction of the glaze that had protected her against her terror, to liberate the rage that it had also held in check, and to search for and establish the beginnings of her real identity. It had not yet permitted her to confront her profound yearning for her parents' love. Now, when her marriage proclaimed her maturity, she was suddenly thrown back to that early defense. Her badness was the cause of her parents' hatred and their wish to kill her, and when she changed, they would love her. Only after patient and persistent confrontation of her fears established an increasing sense of her identity, with its consequent feelings of gratification, could she begin to allow herself to know her parents' reality, and to relinquish her investment in winning their love through self-negation. The process that permitted her to detach herself from the early self-concept created by her response to her parents also enabled her to acknowledge her husband's identity and to separate him from the destructive image of her father. We have seen in the case of Janet that her response to her mother's concealed wish to kill and her father's violence and threats of violence, undiluted by the feeling of being loved, brought her to the brink of psychosis and resulted in an Oedipal fantasy of extraordinary dimensions. Her fixation on marrying her father, which was stimulated by his seductiveness, defended her against her terror of his violence and her fear of being killed by him. In order to survive, she also fantasized that she was non existent, invisible, and unreal, engaged in a campaign of self vilification and self defeat, and developed a glaze designed to hide her true identity from herself as well as from others. Her entry into psychoanalysis at an early age saved her from psychosis and led to her emergence from her illness by helping her to release her murderous rage and to confront her fantasy. She was then able to establish her reality, her existence as a person, a human, and her identity as a woman, as well as to liberate her creative energy. Although her marriage revived her terror of her father's violence, which she projected onto her husband, her persistent struggle for health gradually enabled her to separate them. By forcing herself to acknowledge her father's current reality, she was able to diffuse her terror of him and to relinquish the fantasy of sexual gratification from him that had defended her against it. Her conviction that her life depended on her parents' love and that her badness had caused their hatred and their wish to kill her yielded as her persistent challenge of her fears resulted in the establishment of her real identity. Yeah. Maybe it's just me, but I'm not seeing the part where the parents actually want to kill her or him or whoever the case may be. It's stated and it's repeated often that the parents wanted to kill her. But, is there really any evidence that they wanted to kill her or him or whoever the patient was? I haven't seen in one of these cases except for the ones where there was violence between the mother and father, where you could assume that the child thought that the parents wanted to kill them, but I don't think there was any indication in any of these stories that they actually wanted to kill their child. Maybe they did, who knows, but it just seems like a far stretch, and that it's just being bandied about like common knowledge when to me it didn't seem apparent at all. But what do I know?